Naomi Slate walked the flood bend of the Coldbrook River in the gray hour before full light. A billhook swinging loose in one hand and a coil of tarred cord over her shoulder, cutting the long willow rods that grew wild along the water and binding them into bundles as tall as her own shoulder, while upriver and down, on every farm whose fence line touched that same river, men were dragging that very same brush into piles and setting it burning. By the time she had her third bundle roped to the handcart, Judd Kane was leaning on his rake at the edge of his own smoking brush pile a quarter-mile downriver, laughing loud enough that his hired boy left off feeding the fire to see what the joke was. And the joke, Judd was glad to explain to anyone who would stand still and listen, was the widow Slate hauling home cartloads of ditch trash that nobody in Barrow County would give her a nickel for. The mist was still lying low over the water that morning, the way it did most mornings on the Coldbrook in March, thick enough that the far bank blurred into a gray smear, and the only sounds carrying across it were the crack of Judd Kane's dry brush catching, and, nearer at hand, the wet, patient sound of Naomi's own billhook working through green wood. She did not stop cutting when the laughter reached her. Sound carried flat and clean over open water on a still morning, and she had already decided, 3 days before, that whatever Judd Kane had to say about her business was worth exactly as much of her attention as she gave the crows working his cornfield, which was none at all. She set her boot against the base of the next willow stool, drew the hook up through a rod thick as her thumb, felt it give with a clean, satisfying crack, and laid it across the growing pile at her feet. Barrow County ran long and narrow along the Coldbrook's own course, some 11 miles of bottomland farms strung one after the next like beads on a string, and every farm along it shared the same low, flood-prone acres at its foot and the same spring chore of clearing them. A stranger riding the river road that week would have seen a dozen fires burning along a dozen bends, one after another, and would have had no cause at all to notice that only one bend that whole morning was being worked with a hook and a cord instead of a torch. Her hands, by that third morning of cutting, had already begun to toughen in the particular way a farm woman's hands toughen to new work, a raw place across the base of her right thumb where the hook's handle rubbed, a line of small scratches down both forearms where the brush fought back on its way into the bundle. She did not mind the scratches. She minded the cold far more, the kind of damp, bone-deep March cold that no amount of wool could keep out of a body standing ankle-deep in flood-soaked ground since before sunup, and she worked through it the way she had worked through most things since January, by simply refusing to stop and consider how cold she actually was until the sun came fully up and the work itself began to warm her. Downriver, Judd Kane's fire popped and spat as green wood caught unevenly, and she could smell the smoke of it carrying on the light morning air, mixed with the colder, cleaner smell of the river itself. And she thought, not for the first time that week, that a man burning a resource was at least honest labor for showing how little he valued it, while a woman saving the same resource showed the county nothing at all yet, and would show them nothing for months to come. What Judd Kane did not know, what nobody standing along that flooded river bend that cold morning knew, was that Naomi Slate had spent every evening since the first thaw with her grandmother's old sewing basket, turned over in her lap by the stove, running her thumb along its ribs and its worn, water-stained handle, trying to work out, from memory alone, from a basket that had crossed half a country in a wagon bed and outlived the woman who made it by 15 years, exactly how a rod of willow became a wall, and a wall became something a stranger would hand over real coin to own. If you are the kind of viewer who likes a story where the arithmetic looks flatly impossible at the start and comes out even with interest by the end, then stay with this one all the way through, because this is one of the strangest ledgers in this whole county's history. A widow who spent not one single cent on the resource that saved her, and who still very nearly lost everything proving that it could be done at all. Tap the like button before you go any further into it, and drop the town or the county you are watching from down in the comments, because I do read every one of them. every single time. Now, to understand exactly why a grown woman with a young son to raise was down on that floodbend before sunup, gathering an armload of what her nearest neighbor was, at that very moment setting on fire. You first have to understand precisely what she was standing to lose that spring, and precisely how little she had left in the world to lose it with. The winter of 1867 into 1868 had taken Peter Slate the way lung fever generally took a man in Barrow County, slowly at first, in a manner that let a household go on hoping longer than it should have, and then, in the space of about 10 days, all at once. He had come in soaked through from a wet, late corn harvest that November, the kind of gray, dripping week that never seemed to properly end that year. Working a field he would not leave standing in the mud even after Naomi had asked him twice to wait for a dry spell that never came. By the second week of December, he had a cough that would not leave him. By the middle of January, the cough had taken on a wet, tearing sound Naomi had heard twice before in other houses along that river, and had learned from those 2 earlier deaths to dread the way a farm wife learns to dread a certain shift in the wind before a hailstorm. He was buried on a bitter, iron-hard morning in the last week of January in the small churchyard on the rise above Millstead, and Naomi Slate walked home from that grave a widow at not yet 30 years of age, with a 6-year-old boy named Eli holding tight to her gloved hand the whole way, saying nothing, and a folded promissory note in her late husband's own careful handwriting that she did not fully understand the weight of until she sat alone at her own kitchen table 3 evenings later and read it through for herself, twice by lamplight, with Eli long asleep in the next room. She and Peter had married young, back in the settled eastern part of the state where both their families had farmed for 2 generations, and had come west together the spring after their wedding with a borrowed wagon, a young mule, and more hope than capital, the way most young couples who took up river-bottom land in Barrow County had come. 5 years they had worked that 40 acres together. 5 years of the ordinary run of good seasons and bad, and Naomi had never once, in all that time, imagined she would be the one left standing at the end of it, working the ledger alone by a single lamp turned low to save the oil. The neighbors who came to the house in the days after the funeral, as neighbors always did in that county, brought bread and cold ham and careful, well-meant words about what a fine, hard-working man Peter Slate had been, and not one of them, in Naomi's hearing at least, said a single word about what a widow with a small farm and a smaller boy was actually meant to do with herself come spring planting. She noticed the omission. She did not hold it against any of them particularly. The note itself was for $42, made out the previous August to Elmer Griggs, who ran the grain elevator and the freight forwarding business down at the Millstead Landing, and who conducted a quiet, careful trade in private lending on the side for farmers who needed a new plowshare or a bag of good seed and could not wait on a bank in the county seat to decide, at its own leisure, whether they were worth the risk. Peter had borrowed it in high summer to buy a share for the plow and a bag of seed corn after their old share had cracked clean through against a buried stone in the north field, and he had meant, the way every farmer along that river always meant, to settle the note out of the fall crop. There had been no fall crop worth speaking of. A wet, ruinous harvest and a sick husband had seen to that, and now the note sat unpaid in a kitchen drawer with Elmer Griggs's own neat hand written at the very bottom of it. Due in full, the 1st of October, 1868, and should the sum not be paid in full by that date, the holder reserved the right, under the note's own plain language, to satisfy the debt in stock and household goods. Beginning, the paper specified in a phrase Naomi read 3 times before she trusted she had read it correctly, with livestock. Naomi Slate owned exactly 1 cow. She sat at that kitchen table for a long while on the night she finally understood what beginning with livestock actually meant. For a widow with 1 milk cow, 6 laying hens, a boy to feed and clothe and eventually school, and 40 acres of river-bottom ground that flooded every spring and grew, by her own bitter reckoning that same evening, a great deal more willow brush than anything a body could readily sell. She had a little over $3 in a tin box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom, saved a nickel and a dime at a time over most of a year for no particular purpose beyond the plain habit of saving. She had a garden not yet planted, its seed not yet fully accounted for. She had Eli, who needed new shoes before the summer was out and would need them again, larger, before the following winter came in hard. And she had, by her own careful count that same night, roughly 8 months standing between her and a sum of money that did not yet exist anywhere in the world, in any form she could presently name. A dozen eggs brought 4 cents at Tatum's counter that spring, on the weeks he was buying at all. A full day of washing brought perhaps 15. A whole month of both together, added end to end, would not have closed even a third of what the note demanded, and Naomi had already run that particular sum twice over before she ever looked twice at the flood bend, which was, she told herself afterward, the real reason the Willow finally won her over, not hope, but arithmetic, worked through plainly to its own unavoidable end. She thought first, as any sensible widow in her position would have thought, of everything she might sell outright. There was very little to consider. Peter had not left her rich in movable goods to begin with, a modest but sound house, a barn kept in fair repair, the 1 milk cow, the 6 hens, and the mule Solomon, too old to fetch a real price and far too valuable to a woman meaning to keep farming at all to even seriously consider parting with. She thought of taking in washing for the 2 or 3 families in Milstead who could afford to send it out, and did, in fact, take in a little that whole spring, a few cents the basketful, which brought something steady into the house, but nowhere near enough, and nowhere near fast enough, to answer a note of that size. She thought, and very nearly acted on the thought before setting it aside, of hiring herself out at the coming harvest the way a few of the county's poorer widows sometimes did, standing in a stranger's field from dawn to dusk for whatever a farmer thought her labor worth that season. And she would, in fact, end that year hiring labor of her own rather than her own labor out, in a fashion not one soul in Barrow County would have predicted of her back in February. It was the flood bend itself, though, that kept pulling her eye all through that cold, wet March, because every single spring for as long as she had lived on that river, 5 years now, counting from the spring she and Peter had first come out as newlyweds, the willow brush along the Coldbrook's low ground came back thick and stubborn, and by every measure the county recognized, entirely worthless, and every single spring, without exception, every farmer along that same river cut it to the ground and burned the cuttings where they lay, cursing the work of it the whole while, because it choked the bottom pasture, tangled the mowing come summer, and simply refused to die, no matter how hard or how often a man's hook came down on it. That was the strange thing about it. The thing that had begun turning over quietly at the back of Naomi's mind sometime around the middle of March. While she stood at her own kitchen window one gray morning watching Jud Kane's smoke rise thin and blue over his own flooded bend, the very quality that made willow brush a curse to a working farmer, that it always grew back, stronger if anything, no matter how savagely you cut it down, was, she was almost certain, the exact same quality that had once made her grandmother's basket willow a crop worth deliberately planting back in the low, wet river country of her mother's people, 2 states and 1 whole lifetime away. Naomi's grandmother had never farmed willow in any serious commercial way, so far as Naomi had ever heard tell of it, only kept a small stand of it along a creek behind the house Naomi's own mother had grown up in, cut it back hard every winter the way a person tends any dooryard planting, and wove rough, sturdy mending baskets and a handful of plain market baskets out of it most evenings, more from old habit and plain thrift than any real ambition of trade. Naomi had been 8, 9, 10 years old, sitting at that grandmother's knee on long winter evenings watching those quick, weathered old hands cross rod over rod by firelight, and she had never once thought, as a child sitting comfortably at a grown woman's feet, to ask precisely how it was done. The way a child never thinks to ask the one question that will matter most until the person who could have answered it plainly is 15 years in the ground and past all asking. What Naomi had now in her own kitchen, with a dead husband's debt sitting open in a drawer and a 6-year-old boy asleep in the next room, was exactly one basket her grandmother had made with her own hands. A plain, deep, honestly built market basket that had traveled the better part of a continent folded into a trunk and had served ever since as Naomi's own sewing basket, without her once giving serious thought to where it had come from. And a stubborn, half-formed conviction that if her grandmother's hands could accomplish this with nothing more than a hook, a little patience, and whatever the creek happened to grow that year, her own 2 hands, young and strong and standing entirely idle every evening once Eli was down to sleep, could surely be taught to do the same. There was also this, and Naomi was honest enough with herself, turning it over late that same night with the ledger open in front of her, to name it plainly, rather than dress it up as anything nobler than it was. It would cost her nothing at all to try. She did not own the willow, not in any sense that mattered to the trying of it. Nobody in Barrow County owned that willow in any sense that mattered. It grew wild and entirely unwanted on ground already hers by right, and on ground belonging to half a dozen neighbors besides, who would, she strongly suspected, hand her their own brush piles gladly rather than spend a precious Saturday morning burning them themselves. If she failed outright, if her hands proved too clumsy for the work, if the rods themselves proved impossible to tame, if not one single soul in the whole county would part with a cent for a basket woven by a widow who had never properly been taught the trade, she would have lost nothing in the attempt beyond evenings she would otherwise have spent staring into the stove, mourning a husband no amount of staring would bring back. She could not honestly say the same of a single other scheme she turned over in her mind that whole cold month. A hog cost real money she did not have. A loom cost money. Good wool cost money. Willow cost nothing whatsoever but a strong back, a sharpened hook, and the plain willingness to be laughed at the length and breadth of the county, and Naomi Slate, in the middle of that bleak March, with $42 standing squarely between her and the loss of her only cow, discovered she had a very great deal of that last commodity to spare. So she rose well before light on the morning this story opened. The first morning the river had dropped enough to walk the flood bend safely underfoot, and she went down onto that wet ground with her late husband's own billhook in her hand and her grandmother's 15-year-old memory guiding her, and she began to cut, while Jud Kane burned his own brush not a quarter-mile downriver and laughed at her the whole while she worked. Not yet understanding, not yet able to understand, not for months to come. Precisely what he was watching walk past his own gate that cold gray morning. The cutting itself, Naomi learned, inside of a single hard week, was the most straightforward part of the whole undertaking, and also the part that had to be done exactly right, in exactly the correct narrow window of the season, or nothing that came afterward would matter at all. Willow cut for weaving had to come while the plant still lay fully dormant, while the wood remained hard and quiet, and had not yet begun drawing sap up into new leaf buds, because a rod cut too late in the season, after the buds had visibly broken, dried out weak and brittle in the hand, no matter how patiently it was soaked or handled afterward. Naomi had almost no margin at all on this single point, and she knew it. By the 3rd week of March, the willows crowding the Coldbrook's low ground were already showing the faintest green haze at their very tips, the first soft, dangerous swelling of buds about to break open, and she understood, cutting as fast as her hands and her hook would carry her, that she had perhaps 10 more days, 12 at the outside, before the whole flood bend turned for another 11 months. from an asset back into a nuisance. She cut low, close against the base of each stool, the way she remembered her grandmother describing it once, almost offhand, years and years before. Cut hard, cut close to the ground, and the plant answers you back stronger the following season, sending up more shoots, straighter ones, in gratitude for the pruning rather than in protest of it. And she sorted as she went, by pure instinct at first, and then within a very few days, by a rough system she worked out and steadily refined with her own hands. The straightest, thinnest rods, no thicker than a knitting needle at the butt end, she set carefully aside for the finest work she could imagine attempting. The medium rods, thick as her own smallest finger, went into a second, larger pile. The thick, coarse growth she found scattered here and there among the rest, the 2- and 3-year-old wood that had somehow escaped a farmer's hook the season before, tougher, woodier, and far less willing to bend than any true 1-year rod, she left lying where it fell, or gathered and burned herself in a small pile of her own making, because she had already begun to suspect, correctly as it would turn out before June was out, that mixing that older, stubborn wood in among proper young rods would earn her nothing but grief later on, when it mattered a great deal more than it did now. She noticed, too, working her way down that bend day after day, that not all the willow along the Coldbrook was quite the same plant. Some stools threw up rods with a faint reddish cast to the bark, thin and whippy and almost silky to the touch once stripped. Others ran greener and somewhat coarser, sturdier under the hand, but less graceful in a finished weave. She simply began marking, in her own head and later in her ledger, which particular stools along that bend gave her the rods she liked best working with, a piece of private knowledge that would matter a great deal more to her before the year was out than she yet understood it would. She marked her favorites, that first week, by tying a scrap of red yarn around the base of each stool that had pleased her, a small private code no one but she and Eli could have read, and by the time the cutting season closed, she had 11 such stools marked along her own stretch of the bend alone. By the close of that first exhausting 10 days, she had cut and bundled somewhere near 4,000 rods in total, not only off her own flooded acres, but off 3 of her neighbors' bends besides, because word travels remarkably fast along a river in a county with little else to occupy its talk. And by the second week, 2 of the very men who had laughed loudest at Judd Kane's jokes in the first place were glad enough to let the widow Slate haul away brush they would otherwise have spent a Saturday morning burning at their own expense of time and sweat. One of them, a heavy-set, taciturn farmer named Wilmer Trask, who rarely spoke 10 words to anyone in a week, went so far as to hitch his own team to her loaded handcart twice that fortnight and haul it up the steep track to her barn himself, saying only, when she thanked him, that he'd sooner see the brush hauled off for free than spend his own Saturday burning it, and that what she did with it afterward was her own business and none of his. Naomi kept a careful running count in the same leather ledger she had once used only for the ordinary household accounts, a habit she had never once broken since her wedding year, and she wrote the final tally down the evening she finished the last bend, 3,900 and some rods, cut, hauled, and stacked in loose, orderly bundles along the north side of her own barn, waiting on the part of the whole undertaking she understood by her own honest admission, far less thoroughly than she understood the cutting. A rod fresh off the stool was not, she quickly discovered, anywhere near ready for weaving. It stood stiff as a fence picket and would snap clean in 2 the moment a person so much as tried to bend it gently around her own wrist, and the bark clung to the wood beneath it as tight and unyielding as skin clings to bone. Naomi's grandmother's old basket had been made, she was fairly certain from close study, out of rods that had been properly peeled, stripped down to a pale, smooth, almost ivory-colored wood beneath that stubborn bark. And that peeling, she came to understand through a good deal of trial and a fair measure of error that whole spring, required a cut rod to stand in water long enough for the rising sap inside it to loosen the bark's grip on the wood underneath, the same way a green hide loosens from a carcass in a proper tanning pit. She dug a shallow trench along the low side of her own garden with a spade borrowed from Elmer Griggs's own elevator yard, lined it painstakingly with clay she puddled and packed smooth by hand over 2 full back-breaking afternoons, and stood her best bundles of rods upright in it, butt ends down, filled with water-hauled bucket by bucket from the river until the trench held them the way a strange, entirely leafless garden bed might hold its plantings. Her very first attempt at that trench failed her within a week. The clay lining cracked along one whole side where the ground beneath it had not been packed evenly enough, and she came out one morning to find half her water gone into the surrounding soil overnight and a full bundle of rods drying out unevenly along one flank. She lost perhaps 300 rods to that single mistake, not ruined outright, but weakened enough that she set them into her growing brown rod pile rather than risk them in anything she meant to sell, and she rebuilt the whole trench from the ground up the following week, packing the clay twice as thick and twice as carefully the second time, muttering to herself that a lesson learned in March was a great deal cheaper than the same lesson learned in June, with real money riding on it. It took the better part of 6 weeks in total, that first proper soaking, far longer than she had ever guessed it would when she first dug the trench, and she checked her rods every few days without fail, working a fingernail carefully under the bark near the butt end of one, testing whether it would peel free in a single, long, unbroken ribbon, or whether it clung stubbornly and tore. Too soon, and the bark would not release cleanly at all. She learned, somewhere in the middle of that long 6 weeks, to fashion herself a proper break, riding into Millstead to strike a bargain with the blacksmith there, a broad, taciturn man named Ansel Vilker, who let her have 2 straight iron rods for a dime and the promise of a finished basket in trade once she had one worth giving. Volker, turning the iron over in his own scarred hands before he agreed to the trade, allowed that he had heard what the county was saying about her, and had privately thought, he admitted, that any woman with the nerve to keep working through that much open mockery deserved at least a fair price on 2 lengths of scrap iron, whatever came of the rest of it. She set those 2 rods upright in an old stump behind her barn, just far enough apart to grip a willow rod firmly without ever crushing it flat. She would feed a peeling-ready rod into that narrow iron gap, close her hand over the top of it, and draw the whole length through in one long, steady pull, and the bark would curl away behind her closing fist in a single unbroken ribbon, leaving behind a rod the color of new cream, smooth and supple, and for the very first time since she had cut it, something that genuinely resembled the material her grandmother's basket had been built from. A full bolt of 50 rods, she worked out that spring by plain trial, wanted about a day in the soaking trench for every foot of its own length, and longer yet if the butt ends ran thick. It was a rule she would hear again, word for word, from Elias Tarrant before that same summer was out, the same rule his own father had taught him beside a chalk stream half a world away, which struck her, the first time she heard him say it, as a strange kind of comfort, that a rule worked out alone in a Barrow County ditch could match one carried whole across an ocean. Not every rod she drew through that break came away clean on the first pull. Some tore halfway along their length and had to be finished slowly, tediously, by thumbnail alone. Some, pulled too soon from bundles she had misjudged and left standing too briefly in the trench, would not peel at all, the bark hanging on stubborn and faintly green, and those she set carefully aside, unstripped, in a separate pile she had already begun to think of by early May as her brown rods, bark left deliberately on, coarser and rougher-looking to the eye, but perfectly sound, she strongly suspected, for the rougher class of work, where a fine pale finish would never matter to a buyer in the first place. It was, she told Eli one evening, sorting rods together by lamplight, The first useful thing the willow itself had taught her that whole spring. That a failure in one direction very often turned out, on a second and more patient look, to be a success quietly heading a different way, if a person only troubled herself to look twice before throwing the failure onto the fire. She graded every single rod that came out of that break by length. Standing each one butt down inside a tall grading box she nailed together herself out of scrap board, scavenged from an old fence, 4 sections cut to 4 different heights, so that any rod dropped into it would show its true length plainly against the notched sides without her needing to measure each one out by hand with a rule. The longest and straightest rods, 5 feet and better, she bundled into what she had started calling bolts, the word surfacing back to her from some half-buried childhood memory of her grandmother's own talk. Bolts of 50 rods each, tied firm at both ends with a strip of the very bark she had just finished stripping away, because even the discarded bark, she discovered almost by accident, made a perfectly serviceable tie if nothing better happened to be at hand. By the time the last soaked bundle finally came up out of that rebuilt trench in the first week of May, Naomi Slate had something standing in her barn that she had not possessed 2 full months before. A whole wall of graded, sorted, genuinely weavable willow, and not 1 cent of it purchased, only a blacksmith's dime, a borrowed spade, and roughly 2 months of the coldest, wettest labor of her whole widowed life. She still had to live through all of that same while, and living in Barrow County meant Millstead, and Millstead by the middle of April had a very great deal to say about the widow Slate. Reuben Tatum ran the only general store within 8 miles of her place, a square, sensible, unhurried man who kept a ledger nearly as careful as Naomi's own and extended credit to half the county with a kind of grim, practiced patience that had kept his own shelves reliably stocked through 3 hard years running when a lesser storekeeper might well have failed. Naomi came into his store that April for a spool of good waxed thread, a paper of nails, and a length of oilcloth she needed for lining her new trench, paying cash outright for all 3 items because she had made herself one hard, unbending rule the week Peter died, and had not broken it since. Never again to let her name go into anyone's account book, not for so much as a paper of pins, if she could possibly help it. Tatum rang up her small purchases without a word of comment, exactly as he did for every customer who came through his door, but he had seen the handcart standing outside his window loaded down with willow bundles, and he was not, by long reputation, a man who missed very much that passed under his own nose. "Heard you're clearing brush off half the river bottom, Mrs. Slate," he said at last, not unkindly, sliding her change back across the worn counter. "I am," Naomi said. "Selling it for kindling, are you?" "No," she said, and offered nothing further. He waited a moment, the particular patient way a storekeeper waits when he plainly expects a customer to fill an awkward silence of her own accord, and when she did not oblige him, he simply nodded, the small, settled nod of a man deciding a thing was not, after all, worth pressing any further that morning, and turned back to his shelving. It was the 2 farmers waiting in line behind her who did not let the matter drop nearly so easily. She heard one of them, pitched low but not nearly low enough to escape her, remark to the other that Peter Slate's widow had apparently taken up basket weaving on top of everything else a poor woman had to manage alone, and the second one laughed outright and said he had heard she was hauling in cartloads of the stuff, enough by his reckoning to weave every soul in the county a basket twice over. And what exactly did a woman plan to do with 4,000 sticks of ditch willow that she could not just as easily do with 40? Naomi gathered her small parcel, thanked Mr. Tatum by name, and walked out past both men without offering a single word in reply, because she had already decided, sometime during that first cold week of cutting, that an argument won inside a general store bought her nothing whatsoever and cost her time she genuinely did not have to spare that spring. It was on the road home that same afternoon, though, that the unkind name first reached her, spoken directly to her own face, rather than merely behind her back where she could pretend not to have heard it. She was perhaps half a mile out of town, her cart creaking under a fresh load of grating box lumber, when a wagon passed going the opposite direction, and its driver, a young hired hand from one of the upriver farms, not truly unkind by nature, only careless in the offhand way young men so often are with words that cost them nothing, called out grinning wide, "Careful you don't tip her over, Widow Twiggs." And his companion on the bench beside him laughed loud enough that the sound carried a fair distance down the empty road behind them. Widow Twiggs. It stuck fast, the way an unkind name always seems to stick in a small county, with precious little else to occupy its talk in a slow spring, and by the last week of April, Naomi understood that she had become, without ever quite meaning to, one of Milstead's standing jokes. The poor, hard-up woman so reduced by her circumstances that she had taken to gathering weeds off the riverbank, weaving them into something nobody in the county had actually ordered, and nobody, most people were fairly well convinced, ever seriously would. It followed her even to church that first Sunday in May, where she overheard, standing just outside the door waiting for Eli to find his own coat among a dozen others, two of the deacon's own sisters discussing, in voices meant to carry exactly as far as they did, whether a woman so plainly reduced in her circumstances ought not to consider taking in a boarder instead of chasing after schemes better suited to a child's game than a grown widow's livelihood. She did not correct a single soul on the point, not that Sunday and not at the store, not at the one quilting circle she still made herself attend that spring, chiefly because Eli needed the ordinary company of other children more than she herself needed to avoid a room full of curious, half-pitying eyes turned her way. She simply kept working every evening after her son was safely asleep. By the light of one lamp she was careful to keep trimmed low to spare the oil, and she kept her ledger faithfully, and in the first week of May, that ledger recorded, in her own small, careful hand, its very first sale. It was not by any measure a large sale. A farm wife named Dorcas Mabry, no kin whatsoever, Naomi was always careful to explain afterward to anyone who asked, simply a stranger passing through from 3 farms upriver who had stopped to water her horse at the well by the road, noticed 2 small, plain market baskets sitting out on the porch rail drying in the morning sun, baskets Naomi had woven chiefly as practice rather than as any serious product, and asked, with what struck Naomi as genuine curiosity rather than mockery, whether the baskets happened to be for sale. Naomi named a price of 15 cents apiece, a figure she had turned over carefully for the better part of an evening beforehand, weighing the hours of labor against the cost of nothing, against what she guessed a sensible woman might actually be willing to pay for a basket sound enough to carry eggs to market without ever splitting a seam. Dorcas Mabry paid the full 30 cents for both baskets without so much as a moment's haggling, tucked them carefully into her own wagon bed, remarked that the weave looked tighter than half of what she'd seen sold at the county fair the previous autumn, and drove on toward town without ever learning she had just become, in her own small and entirely unwitting way, a piece of local history. Naomi carried those 2 dimes and that single nickel back into the house cupped in one palm, and set them down on the kitchen table beside her open ledger, and she sat looking at them in the lamplight for a long, quiet moment before she trusted her hand to write the entry. May the 4th, 2 baskets, 30 cents. It was the very first money the Willow had ever earned her in the whole of its short mocked existence, and it was, measured honestly against $42, so small a sum that a less stubborn woman might well have laughed along with the rest of the county by then, and quietly let the whole scheme drop as a poor widow's cold-weather fancy. Naomi did not laugh. She understood, sitting at that table with 30 cents laid out before her and Eli's small, worn shoes drying by the warm stove, that she had just proven something no amount of argument inside a general store could ever have proven on her behalf, that a perfect stranger, with no earthly reason in the world to be kind to her, would hand over real coin for a thing made entirely out of what every other soul in Barrow County was, that very same week, still dragging into piles and setting alight. A second sale followed within the fortnight. Smaller yet somehow more satisfying for how plainly it proved the first had been no accident of one kind stranger's whim. A young school teacher boarding in Milstead, needing something sturdy to carry her dinner pail and her books together, bought a single fine market basket for 18 cents, tried the handle twice with real weight in it before she would pay, and told Naomi, with the particular blunt honesty of a woman who has clearly been taught to examine goods before buying them, that it was better made than anything presently on Reuben Tatum's own shelves. Naomi thanked her, said nothing further, and walked home, turning that one unguarded sentence over and over in her mind the whole way, because it was the very first time all spring that anyone in the whole of Barrow County had compared her work favorably to anything at all, rather than simply laughing at the fact that it existed. The weaving itself, Naomi found before that first month was half done, belonged to a different order of difficulty than either the cutting or the long, patient soaking, and it took her the better part of that whole spring, working alone by lamplight after Eli was safely down for the night, to make her own two hands do reliably what her grandmother's 15-year-old memory kept insisting, with a stubbornness of its own, that they ought to be able to do. A basket she had worked out slowly from turning her grandmother's own old market basket over and over in her lap, examining its underside the careful way a person studies the inner workings of a watch. They mean eventually to take fully apart, began not with the sides at all, but with the base. A small, flat cross of 4 or 5 stouter rods, each one split partway down its own center with a sharp knife, so that thinner rods could be threaded crosswise through those splits at a clean right angle, the whole small arrangement pinned flat to the tabletop with a single tack, while she worked the first true weaving rod around it in a tight, even spiral, slowly binding the crossed sticks together into something that would hold its own shape firmly under its own weight once the tack came free. Her grandmother, she remembered now with a small private satisfaction, had called this first piece the slath, a word Naomi had heard exactly once as a child of perhaps 9, and had not consciously thought of again in 20 years, and she said it quietly aloud to herself, the first evening she finally managed to bind a slath that did not spring apart the instant she lifted the tack away. It did not go well for her, that whole first month of long evenings. Her fingers, strong enough from ordinary farm work as they undeniably were, possessed none of the particular patient strength required to hold 4 crossed rods flat and taut all at once, while simultaneously weaving a 5th rod tightly around them. And her first 11 honest attempts at a base either sprang loose the very moment she set them down on the table, or came out so far from anything resembling round that she could not, by any fair or generous measure, have called the result anything but hopelessly lopsided. She kept every single one of those 11 failed bases in a basket by the hearth, rather than burning them for kindling as she might easily have done, not entirely out of sentiment, though there was some of that too, but chiefly because she had already learned from the willow itself that a thing which failed cleanly at one purpose sometimes went on to teach a person something genuinely useful toward the very next attempt, if she only kept it near enough to study. Some nights that whole month she worked past the point of good sense, her eyes stinging in the lamplight, her fingers cramped from holding tension too long, and told herself sternly that she would stop after the next attempt, and did not stop, because the next attempt always seemed, in the particular stubborn logic of 2 in the morning, likely to be the one that finally held. Eli, old enough by 6 years to be endlessly and cheerfully curious about anything at all his mother did with her hands after supper, took to sitting on the floor beside her chair most evenings, sorting loose rods by length into small piles for her. A game to him entirely, real and welcome help to her. And he was the one who laughed first, not unkindly, the night her 12th attempt at a base came out so badly skewed that it genuinely resembled, set flat on the table between them, a cartwheel that had been run clean over by its own wagon. "That one's crooked, Mama," he said, quite matter-of-factly. And Naomi looked at it a long moment in the lamplight and then laughed too, honestly and without any bitterness at all, because it was, without the smallest question, the most crooked object she had produced yet in the whole of her short career, and there was no earthly use pretending otherwise to a plain-spoken 6-year-old who could see perfectly well for himself. The 13th base held. She could not have said afterward, with any real precision, exactly what she had done differently that time. Some new and unnamed combination of tension held steady in her left hand, and a slower, more deliberate pull with her right, learned the only way any true skill of the hands is ever finally learned, which is through failure honestly repeated rather than through instruction cleverly given. But the 13th base came away from the table flat, tight, and true, round as a plate fresh off a potter's wheel, and she sat looking at it in the lamplight for a long while before she trusted herself to move on to the next stage of the work. From that one flat sound base, she taught herself to set her upright stakes, the ribs that would eventually rise to become the actual walls of the finished basket, each one sharpened carefully at the butt end and driven firmly down into the weave of the base beside its own matching rod, standing up around the whole circle like the bars of some small, patient cage, waiting only to be filled in. Staking up, her memory offered her the proper term, quite unbidden, somewhere around her 20th honest attempt, and once she had a full ring of stakes standing true and evenly spaced around a sound base, she understood that she had, for the very first time in that whole strange spring, something sitting on her own kitchen table that any stranger walking in through her door would have recognized at a single glance as the honest beginning of an actual basket, and not merely a widow's private and possibly foolish way of filling her lonely evenings. She was not yet, by the 3rd week of May, a woman who could rightly call herself a basket maker, and she was careful, even alone with only Eli and the lamp for company, never to claim more skill for herself than she had actually earned. She was a woman with 13 genuinely sound bases behind her, some 40 ruined ones stacked by the hearth, as kindling she still, for whatever private reason, could not quite bring herself to burn. 2 small sales entered carefully in her ledger totaling 48 cents, and a debt of $41.52 still standing squarely between her and the 1st of October. But she had, for the first time since the funeral back in January, something in her own 2 hands that felt considerably less like a widow's desperate, grief-stricken scheme, and a great deal more like the slow, unglamorous, entirely ordinary beginning of a real trade, and she went to bed most of those nights with her hands raw and cross-hatched with small fresh cuts from the willow bark, and slept. More nights than not that whole spring, better than she had slept in any of the long months since the funeral. It was in the last week of May, with her stakes finally standing true, and her hands finally steady enough to be trusted with real, deliberate work, that Naomi Slate first properly met a man named Elias Tarrant, though in a quieter sense she had, without ever knowing it, been meeting him for the better part of 2 months already. Tarrant was an old man, well past 70 years by his own reckoning, who lived alone in a small, scrupulously tidy cabin a mile past the Millstead Mill, on a scrap of ground too rocky and too heavily shaded ever to farm properly and too close to the public road to be worth much for anything else a man might have wanted it for. He had come west as a young man of barely 20 from the county of Kent, in the old country, where his own father had kept what he called, in the flat, unhurried way he had of speaking about anything that mattered to him, a proper osier holt, some 3 acres of deliberately planted willow running along a chalk stream, cut back hard each winter and sold on, bundle by graded bundle, to basket makers working up and down that same narrow valley for the better part of 2 full generations before Elias Tarrant himself had ever been born into the trade. He had learned the whole craft at his own father's knee the way a boy learns anything he is set to young and kept at steadily, and he had gone on weaving baskets for his actual living on and off for the better part of 50 years across 3 different counties in 2 different countries before his own hands had finally stiffened and slowed with the particular kind of rheumatism that no longer let him hold a fine, even tension in his fingers for more than an hour at any single stretch. He still watched the craft closely, though, the way an old fiddler who can no longer properly play still cannot help himself from listening critically to every tune a younger hand takes up nearby. And he had, in point of fact, been watching Naomi Slate on and off since the 3rd week of March, from the far side of the Coldbrook, without ever once troubling to make himself known to her directly. What finally brought him down to her own gate was not the cutting, nor the long soaking, nor even the 2 small sales to Dorcas Mabry and the schoolteacher, word of which reached him only the way most things reached Elias Tarrant, second-hand and slow, carried along by whoever happened to pass his cabin on the road. It was, instead, a single basket Naomi had given away as a small, plain thank you to the neighbor 2 farms over, who had let her clear the Willow off his own flooded bend that spring free of any charge or condition. A plain little basket, one of her earlier honestly good ones, a shade uneven yet at the rim but sound and tightly woven throughout. And Tarrant had happened to see that very basket sitting out on the neighbor's own porch rail during his own slow daily walk to the mill, and had stopped, entirely uninvited, to turn it over carefully in his own stiff old hands for a full 5 minutes before he thought to ask, quite bluntly, who in the county had made it. He arrived at Naomi's gate the following evening just at dusk, leaning his full weight on a blackthorn walking stick worn smooth and dark from long years of use, and stood there without coming any nearer until she noticed him from the doorway and came out herself to see what business had brought him. "You're the one weaving that willow off the flood bend," he said, without any preamble at all. It was not offered as a question. "I am," Naomi said, wary by long habit that spring, because in her own hard experience by then, most conversations opening in that particular flat, direct fashion in Barrow County had a way of ending in some fresh joke made plainly at her expense. "Your stakes are set a shade too wide apart at the base," Tarrant said, still without the smallest preamble. "And I'd wager good money you're randing your sides the plain way a person weaves who's never once been properly shown different, over one rod under the next, straight round, and wondering all the while why the weave won't ever pack down tight and even the way it ought to. There's a particular rhythm to it your own hand hasn't found on its own yet. Not fully. I could show you, if you've a mind to be shown by an old man nobody in this county has any further use for." Naomi stood in her own dooryard for a long considering moment, studying this blunt stranger from head to foot, and then she stood aside from her own door and let him in, and that whole evening, sitting together at her kitchen table with a half-finished basket set between them, Elias Tarrant showed her for the very first time the real difference between simple randing, one single rod at a time, over and under building the basket's wall a single plain course at a stretch, and the far stronger twisted weave called waling, worked with 3 rods carried together in a tight rope-like turn, which he set carefully into the bottom 2 inches of every basket wall he had ever made to keep the whole structure from ever working loose under a real, honest load of apples or eggs or stone. He showed her, too, before that first long evening was out, how a finished wall was properly brought to a close, how the standing stakes, once the sides had risen high enough, were bent smoothly down one over the next in a plaited border, tucked and trimmed back into the weave itself, so that the whole rim finished firm and rounded with no raw end left standing to catch on a sleeve or split loose under a hard swing of the handle. A piece of the work Naomi had been finishing crudely with a simple wrapped binding until that very night. He showed her, patient despite his own stiffened fingers, how to pack each finished course down firm and tight, with the flat of her own thumb and the heel of her palm, before ever starting the next course above it, so the whole weave came out dense and even throughout rather than loose and gap-toothed the way her earliest baskets had come out. He watched her work steadily for the better part of an hour, correcting the angle of her wrist twice with a light, careful touch, and told her a good deal, in between corrections, of his own long life, of the chalk stream behind his father's holt in Kent, of the ship that had carried him west as a boy of 20, with nothing to his name but a good knife and his father's teaching, and of the slow, sorrowful way his own trade had finally left his stiffened hands behind, one difficult winter at a time, until he had very nearly resigned himself to watching real basket work die out of Barrow County altogether within his own lifetime. He told her, too, before he left that first evening, the rough scale his own father had always priced by beside the chalk stream. A bolt of the finest white rods worth 2 or 3 bolts of the coarse brown, a well-bordered market basket worth half again what a loose, poorly finished one would ever fetch, and a maker's own name, once it was known and trusted up and down a county, worth more in the end than all the rest of it put together, since a buyer will pay gladly for certainty and only grudgingly for anything less. When he finally rose to leave that evening, leaning hard once more on the blackthorn stick, he left her with one single piece of advice she would have very particular cause to remember, word for word, before the month of June was entirely out. "Never once trust a rod you haven't properly bent first," he told her at the door. "Take it up in both hands, close by the butt end, and flex it sharp before it ever once goes into your weave. If it bends smooth and easy, it's ready and sound. If it whitens along the bend or cracks anywhere at all down its length, it wants either a good deal more soaking or the scrap pile outright. And there is no deadline standing on God's own earth worth the risk of putting a rod like that into a basket some paying stranger is trusting with real coin." Naomi thanked him sincerely and meant every word of it, and did not, in the honest accounting she made of herself later that same summer, hold to his advice quite as closely as she plainly should have, because it was that very week, almost to the day, that Reuben Tatum walked into her own dooryard with an order that was about to test every single thing Elias Tarrant had just so patiently tried to teach her, on a deadline that would leave her no real room at all to test so much as one single rod the careful way he had shown her. Tatum's order was, on its own face, exactly the sort of opportunity Naomi had been quietly hoping for since the very first morning she had walked out onto that flood bend back in March. 2 full dozen fruit-picking baskets, shallow-bodied and carefully softened at the rim so the fruit inside would never bruise against bare willow, wanted at 20 cents apiece, $4.80 in total. If she delivered the whole order sound and complete, which was more money riding on a single arrangement than every basket she had sold up to that point put together twice over. There was, however, one condition attached to the offer that made the whole undertaking a good deal harder than it first appeared sitting across the counter from him. A traveling drummer working the river road on behalf of a wholesale house down in the county seat was passing back through Milstead in just 8 days' time, and Tatum, sensing a genuine opportunity to place a standing order for baskets with a buyer who could move real quantity well beyond the borders of Barrow County altogether, wanted the full 2 dozen finished, tested, and sitting proudly in his own store window before that particular drummer's wagon ever rolled through town again. 8 days, Naomi understood clearly enough sitting at her own kitchen table that same evening, was nowhere near sufficient time to cut fresh rods, soak them the full 6 weeks she now knew from hard experience they truly wanted, strip them properly, grade them by hand, and weave 2 dozen genuinely sound baskets from nothing. She worked that grim arithmetic through fully, honestly, before ever giving Tatum her answer, and she made, in the space of that single long evening, the single worst decision of her entire willow season. Rather than turn the order down outright, or ask Tatum plainly for more time and risk losing the whole arrangement to her own caution, she decided instead to work from rods already cut and only partly soaked, rods that had not yet had anywhere near the full length of time in the trench that her very best bolts had earned, and to fill out the back half of the order when those ran short toward the end of the week as she had privately feared they might, with some of the thicker, coarser second-year growth she had set aside back in March and never quite gotten around to burning as she had originally intended. She worked those 8 days very nearly around the clock, sleeping in short, uneasy snatches between long stretches at the workbench, with Susan Dyer not yet hired to help share the burden, and Eli doing his small best to keep himself quietly occupied through long stretches of a mother too consumed with deadline work to give him his usual full attention. More than once that week, she caught herself reaching for a rod without so much as glancing at it twice, telling herself she would test it properly once there was time, and each time that moment simply never came, swallowed up by the next rod and the next hour of work still owed before morning. She finished the complete 24 baskets on the evening of that 8th and final day, every single one of them sound-looking to the plain eye, tightly woven, evenly bordered, exactly the kind of honest work Elias Tarrant would surely have approved of at first glance across a room. She did not, in the exhausted rush of that last long night, take the careful time to flex-test every single rod near its own butt end, the precise way he had so recently shown her at her own kitchen table. She told herself, delivering the finished baskets to Tatum's store the following morning with real pride in her own tired chest, that she had watched each individual rod closely enough as she wove it in, that her own eye alone was surely trustworthy after 3 full months of steady, disciplined practice, and she was wrong about that, in a manner that cost her a good deal more than money before that particular week was finally out. The drummer, as ill fortune would have it, arrived a full day earlier than Tatum had planned for. Tatum, eager and understandably proud to show off his handsome new stock to a buyer worth impressing, pulled one of Naomi's fresh fruit-picking baskets straight down off the shelf right there in front of the man, loaded it briskly with a dozen good apples drawn from his own store bin to properly demonstrate the weight it could reliably carry, and lifted the whole thing by its handle for the drummer's close inspection. And the handle itself, bound to the rim with a single rod that had never once been flex-tested, split clean through at the bind without the smallest warning, dumping every last apple across Reuben Tatum's own polished store floor in plain view of 6 separate customers, one of whom, by the particular cruelty of small county luck, happened to be Judd Kane himself, in that same morning for his weekly tobacco, laughing out loud before the very last apple had even finished rolling to a stop against the counter's base. Tatum, thoroughly embarrassed in front of a buyer he had hoped to impress with quality goods, tested 3 more baskets from that same batch right there on the spot, working each one hard with both hands the exact way a serious wholesale buyer surely would have tested them, and found 2 further baskets with rods that cracked white and ragged rather than bending smooth under real pressure. Precisely the failure Elias Tarrant had warned her about, almost word for word, not 2 weeks before. He rejected the entire order that same morning without a moment's further hesitation, all 24 baskets returned outright, refusing payment on any single one of them. And by that very same evening, the story of the Widow Slate's baskets falling clean apart inside Reuben Tatum's own store had already traveled the full length of Barrow County faster than any single story Naomi had yet managed to outrun that whole spring. "Widow Twigs," people said again, with fresh and evident relish, ought by rights to stick to gathering plain firewood, since she plainly could not be trusted to weave anything sturdier out of the same worthless brush, and Judd Kane, by every account that later reached her second hand, told that same apple story at the tobacco counter for the better part of a full week running, embellishing it a little further, she gathered, with each fresh telling. Naomi sat with those 24 rejected baskets stacked in a sorry pile in her own front room for 2 full days, before she could trust herself to look at them without her hands beginning to shake all over again. She told Eli, when he asked why she was not weaving that evening, only that she was resting her hands, which was not entirely a lie, though it was a good deal short of the whole truth. And she lay awake a long while that second night, turning over in the dark, whether she had simply mistaken one lucky spring for a real trade, and whether the county's laughter had been the honest truth of the matter all along, dressed up only more kindly than she deserved by two strangers' small, early sales. It was Elias Tarrant, hearing the whole sorry story second-hand from a farmer who happened to stop at his gate on the road, who came to find her again, entirely unasked, on the evening of that second hard day. He did not scold her, not by so much as a single sharp word. He simply picked up one of the split handles from the pile, turned it over slowly in his own stiff old fingers, and said only, "There. You see it plainly enough now, don't you? Cracked white clean along the bend, precisely as I told you it would. This particular rod wanted another full fortnight in the water before it was ready for any weave at all, and this one here—" He lifted a second broken piece from the pile for her to examine for herself. "Is 2-year wood clear through, thick through its own heart, and has no more honest business inside a fine basket than a fence rail would. You knew both these particular things perfectly well a month ago when I first showed you. You only went and forgot them under a hard deadline, which happens to be the very oldest mistake in this whole trade, in any country you'd care to name, and very nearly the only one of its kind that costs a person real money instead of merely a little pride. Naomi asked him that same difficult evening, the one question she had been quietly afraid to put to any living soul since the moment Tatum's messenger boy had first come to tell her the whole order stood refused. Whether it was even worth the continued effort. Whether a county that already called her Widow Twiggs so freely behind her own back would ever trust a basket bearing her name again after such a public and thoroughly humiliating failure. Tarrant considered the question for a long, unhurried moment. The deliberate way he seemed to consider everything of real consequence, and told her plainly that in 50 full years of the trade, spread across 2 separate countries, he had never once in his life known a genuine buyer who cared, in the final and lasting accounting, what a basket-maker's own idle neighbors happened to say about her, so long as the very next basket held firm precisely where the first one had shamefully failed. A reputation lost over one single bad batch, he told her, was a debt exactly like any other kind, payable in full eventually, with good and honest work delivered faithfully on time, and never under any circumstance whatsoever one single day sooner than that. She rebuilt that entire ruined order from the ground up over the following 2 full weeks, drawing this time only from her very best, longest-soaked bolts, flex-testing every single rod near its own butt end exactly as he had originally shown her before it was ever once allowed to touch her actual weave, and setting aside, without the smallest shred of hesitation this second time through, absolutely anything that so much as hesitated under the honest test of a hard bend. She delivered a fresh 24 fruit-picking baskets to Reuben Tatum on a Tuesday morning in the middle of June, said nothing at all beyond a plain, level good morning, and stood quietly in his own store while he tested every single basket himself, one after another, loading each in turn with a full dozen apples and swinging it hard by the handle, 3, 4, even 5 separate times, in plain view of whichever customers happened to be standing nearby that particular morning. Every single basket held firm. Tatum paid her the complete $4.80 right there on the spot, without the smallest further argument, added, after one long considering pause of his own, a standing weekly order for a dozen plain market baskets going forward at 15 cents apiece, and told her in the same flat, entirely businesslike voice he used for every transaction that crossed his counter that he had never in his years of keeping store known a single supplier to answer a genuine failure quite that thoroughly, and that he did not expect, going forward, to have any further cause to doubt her work. By the last week of June, Naomi's own barn held something the whole county could plainly see for itself at last, whether or not any soul in it cared to admit as much out loud. Row upon row of finished, honestly sound baskets, ranged carefully along shelving she and Eli had built together out of scrapboard, pale, fine market baskets woven from her very best white rods, sturdier brown-barked harvest baskets built patiently from the rods that had never fully peeled clean, and a fresh, properly tested batch of fruit-picking baskets standing ready against Tatum's own new standing order. It was not by any fair measure a fortune yet. It remained, weighed honestly against the $42 still owed and the steadily shrinking calendar running from June toward October, a long, uncertain way from anything resembling safety. But it was. For the very first time since the day she had first walked out onto that flood bend back in March. A genuine trade that had survived its own worst and costliest mistake and come out plainly stronger on the far side of it. And that, Elias Tarrant told her simply, leaning on his blackthorn stick in her own dooryard and watching her carry yet another finished basket up onto the shelf, was worth a very great deal more to any trade over the long run than any unbroken run of easy luck could ever possibly have been worth. It was Reuben Tatum, in the end, who quietly put the right basket into precisely the right hands, though he would always insist he had done nothing more than his ordinary duty of keeping a well-stocked store. Jonas Pratt owned the largest orchard in the whole of Barrow County, close on 1,100 trees of apple and pear spread along both sides of the river road east of Milstead, and he came into Tatum's store in the first week of July, as he did most weeks of the growing season, to settle his running account and pick up whatever small goods his own well-run farm did not otherwise supply. He was, by every account Naomi ever heard told of him afterward, a careful, unhurried, deliberate man who had built that orchard up over some 20 patient years from a rocky, unpromising 40 acres that nobody else in the county had ever particularly wanted, and he did not, as a settled rule of his own, buy anything at all, tools, seed, or baskets alike, without turning the object over in his own two hands a good deal longer than most ordinary men thought strictly necessary. Tatum, restocking his own shelf of picking baskets that same afternoon, and still visibly, if quietly, proud of the batch that had cost him one bruised reputation and one thoroughly bruised drummer's good opinion before it had finally earned him that renewed pride, set one of Naomi's own fruit baskets down on the counter directly in front of Pratt, without any real word of introduction beyond a plain, "Try that one there, Jonas. Go on and put your full weight into it, same as you would out working your own orchard." Pratt did precisely that, without the smallest hesitation. He gripped the handle firmly with both hands and swung the basket hard, twice over, the deliberate way a man tests something he genuinely intends to trust with a whole season's worth of income riding on it. And when the handle held perfectly firm, and the weave itself did not so much as flex out of true under the strain, he turned the basket completely over in his hands, studied the border closely where the stake ends folded neatly down into the finished rim, ran his own thumbnail slowly along the packed weave to check precisely how tight the courses had been drawn, and asked Tatum, in the same unhurried, deliberate voice he used for absolutely everything, exactly who in the county had made it. He rode out to Naomi's own place himself 2 full days later, entirely unannounced, and stood a long while in her dooryard, examining a further dozen baskets pulled straight down off her own shelves, testing each one the identical, careful way he had first tested the one in Tatum's store, swinging every basket hard by its handle, pressing his thumb firmly into the packed weave, holding 2 or 3 of them up against the light in turn, to check the honest evenness of the courses throughout. He asked her a fair number of careful questions about the willow itself that afternoon, where precisely it came from, how long it had properly soaked, whether she genuinely meant to keep up the supply reliably through the whole of the coming fall. And Naomi, standing in her own dooryard answering the pointed questions of a man whose single orchard alone was worth considerably more than every farm along her own stretch of river put together, kept her voice as level and as businesslike as she could honestly manage, though her heart, she admitted afterward to no one at all but her own private ledger that same night, had not beaten quite so hard inside her chest since the bitter morning of Peter's own funeral back in January. Pratt placed his order that same afternoon, standing right there in her dooryard, for 150 picking baskets in total, wanted whole, tested, and fully ready by the first week of September, when his own earliest apples would begin coming in off the trees, at 20 cents apiece. $30 full, more money riding on one single order than Naomi had earned across the entire remainder of that year put together up to that point. And he added, almost as an afterthought, climbing back up onto his own wagon seat, that if the baskets genuinely proved themselves through a full hard season of real picking, hauled and dropped and swung about all day long by tired hired hands from first light until well past dusk, the way orchard baskets always inevitably were, he would very likely be back again the following spring wanting fully twice that number from her. Naomi did not, that particular July, have anywhere near 150 finished baskets worth of properly graded rod standing ready on her own shelves. And she understood clearly enough, working the hard arithmetic through at her own kitchen table that same evening, that filling Pratt's whole order without ever repeating the costly mistake that had already cost her Tatum's first order once meant she plainly needed more hands at work than her own two alone could reasonably provide. She hired within that same week a widowed neighbor's daughter named Susan Dyer, just 16 years old, and genuinely glad of honest, steady wage work after her own family had fallen on hard times the previous winter when her father's own team had drowned crossing a swollen ford. Susan came to her first morning of work with her sleeves already rolled and a plain, watchful seriousness about her that Naomi recognized at once, having worn something close to that same expression herself not so many months before. And Naomi found, within the first week of teaching her the grading and the stripping, the particular parts of the whole craft that asked chiefly for patience and a good, careful eye rather than years of hard-won practice, that the girl had a genuine gift for spotting a poorly soaked rod at a glance, faster even than Naomi's own eye had learned to manage by that point. Naomi herself kept every single finished basket's actual weaving firmly under her own hand throughout that summer, checking, exactly as Elias Tarrant had so patiently taught her, that not one single rod went into any wall of Jonas Pratt's order without first being properly bent close by the butt to prove it genuinely sound before it ever touched her weave. By the middle of August, with 3 full weeks still safely in hand before Pratt's own deadline arrived, the first 60 baskets of that whole large order stood finished, tested, and waiting on her shelves, and Naomi Slate, for the very first time since January, allowed herself to seriously believe that the first day of October might not, after everything, cost her the only milk cow she owned in the whole world. Word of Jonas Pratt's substantial order moved through the whole of Barrow County the same way every fresh piece of news moved through it that particular summer, which was to say quickly, and in a form somewhat larger and more impressive, by the time it finally reached the far end of the county than it had ever actually been at the start. By the time Garrett Loomis, who ran the county's one substantial hop yard on some 40 trellised acres north of Milstead, rode down himself to see Naomi's baskets firsthand in the last week of July, the story then circulating freely had Pratt ordering something closer to 300 baskets outright rather than 150, which was not strictly true yet at that particular moment, though it would in fact prove closer to the eventual truth than anyone quite realized before that whole long season finally ran its course. Loomis was a brisk, weathered man who had grown hops along the Coldbrook for the better part of 15 years, ever since a bad tobacco season had turned him toward what he liked to call with a dry humor Naomi came to appreciate. A crop that at least has the decency to climb its own poles, and he needed baskets built to a rather different standard than Pratt's own light fruit pickers required. Deeper through the body, considerably sturdier throughout, built specifically to take the real weight and the genuinely rough handling of hop-picking work, where whole families labored the long trellised rows together through late August into September, stripping the ripe cones free by hand and dumping them, basket load after basket load, into waiting sacks and crates set at the row ends. He tested her work the same blunt way Pratt had, though with rather less ceremony about it, simply upending one loaded basket hard onto the packed dirt of her own dooryard to see whether the base would give, and when it held firm under that rough treatment, he grunted what Naomi took, correctly as it turned out, for approval, and ordered 120 of them from her that same afternoon, brown-barked throughout, and built noticeably heavier in the weave than her fine market baskets, at 18 cents apiece, $21.60 in total, wanted complete by the middle of August, a deadline Naomi met that time around with a full 3 weeks still comfortably to spare, because she had learned in the hard and bitter arithmetic of Tatum's once-rejected order never again to promise any buyer a delivery date her own soaking trench could not honestly and reliably support. By August, the orders arriving at her door were no longer coming in one careful, considered transaction at a time, each one a small event she recorded thoughtfully by itself in her ledger the way she once had. They arrived instead in a steady, overlapping stream that she and Susan Dyer could barely keep proper pace with, even working long days that stretched reliably from well before dawn until well past full dark most evenings that month. 3 smaller orchards strung along the river road, having watched Jonas Pratt's baskets quietly prove themselves sound through the early picking weeks, sent word wanting their own reliable supply before the main body of the apple crop came fully in. A dairy farmer 2 full townships over, who had heard of the baskets not through any orchard connection at all, but through his own wife's quilting circle, wanted a dozen sturdy market baskets built for hauling fresh eggs and butter safely to the county fair that autumn. Even the small Millstead church itself sent word wanting 6 plain baskets for its annual harvest social, the 6 baskets paid for cheerfully out of the deacon's own personal pocket rather than out of the general collection plate, which struck Naomi, entering that particular small sale into her ledger one quiet evening, as one of the stranger and gentler little ironies of that whole remarkable season, given that it had been the deacon's own sisters, back in May, standing outside that same small church suggesting she take in a boarder instead. She rode out to Jonas Pratt's own orchard herself in the first week of September, at his own personal invitation, to see her baskets genuinely at work in the one setting that mattered a great deal more to her than any store counter or any neighbor's passing opinion ever could, a full 150 of them, exactly as originally ordered, moving steadily up and down the picking ladders in the sure hands of Pratt's own hired crews, swinging easily from hooks set at the top rung of each ladder, filled and emptied and filled again a dozen full times a day under a hot September sun, and not one single basket, so far as Pratt's own foreman reported to her standing there in the cool shade of a heavily loaded tree, had failed even once across a full week of hard, continuous use. Pratt himself walked the long rows with her that whole afternoon, watched 2 of his own pickers work a heavily laden branch with baskets that had already carried a full week's steady harvest, without so much as one loosened stake anywhere along the weave, and told her plainly, without any particular ceremony, that his own early apples were coming in considerably heavier that year than he had ever budgeted for back in the spring, and that he would want a further 100 baskets from her before the main body of his crop finally turned, if she could reasonably manage to supply them in time. Garrett Loomis, for his own part, sent word back to her not long after his hop pickers finished their own hard September work that every single one of his 120 baskets had come through the whole rough picking season without a single failure, and that he fully intended, he wrote in a short, plainly worded note carried down by his own foreman to double his own order the following year, provided she could reliably supply the volume he now had firmly in mind, and he added that he'd tell any hop grower who asked that the Widow Slate's baskets had outlasted 2 of his own hired men that season, more than he could honestly say for most things sold to him out of Milstead. Naomi saw one of her own hop-picking baskets in real use for the first time on a Saturday errand out to Loomis's own yard that September, swinging easy from the belt of a picker she did not know by name. A girl of perhaps 14, working a trellised row alongside her own mother, both of them moving down the line with the calm, unhurried rhythm of people who trust their tools well enough not to think about them at all, which struck Naomi, watching quietly from the wagon seat, as the truest compliment her whole season's work had yet been paid. Naomi rode home from Pratt's orchard that particular evening past Judd Kane's own gate, and though she did not slow her wagon or so much as glance directly toward his own dooryard as she passed, she was fully and quietly aware, by every account that reached her second-hand afterward, that Judd Kane had been standing at his own fence line that same week, watching a steady, unmistakable traffic of loaded wagons roll past his own farm, bound for the Widow Slate's place that he himself had once mocked so freely and so loudly for hauling home cartloads of nothing at all, and saying, for once in that whole long and talkative season, considerably less about the whole matter than he had ever been known to say before. By the last week of September, Naomi Slate sat down at her own kitchen table on a quiet Sunday evening, the one single evening each week she still allowed herself entirely free of the workshop, and ran the full season's figures carefully from the very beginning, exactly the way she had quietly promised herself back in bleak March that she eventually would, the moment the final number sitting in front of her finally looked as though it might genuinely prove sufficient. The willow itself, cut and gathered off her own bend and 3 separate neighbors' bends besides, had cost her nothing at all in the end, beyond her own steady labor, and a blacksmith's single borrowed dime for the 2 iron bars of her brake. Against that one small dime, she carefully set down what the whole season had actually brought in, column by patient column, $2.40 from those first uncertain weeks of small market basket sales made along the open road and across Tatum's own counter, $4.80, finally collected in full at long last, from the rebuilt fruit basket order that had once cost her so dearly in both money and pride together. A running weekly account with Reuben Tatum for a dozen market baskets every week since the middle of June, which alone had quietly brought in something over $9 by the season's actual close, $21.60 from Garrett Loomis and his own hop yard, with a further order already firmly promised for the following spring, and from Jonas Pratt, whose second order of a further 100 baskets she and Susan Dyer had finished together, with a full 4 days still to spare before his main crop finally turned. $50 in total across both of his separate orders combined. More money from one single orchard than Naomi had ever believed possible back in July, standing in her own dooryard, answering his careful, deliberate questions, with her heart pounding hard beneath an outwardly level voice. Smaller orders scattered right across the whole summer, drawn from 3 separate orchards, 1 dairy farmer, the church's own harvest social, and a full dozen individual households she had lost any precise count of by September, added a further $18 and some odd change besides to the bottom of that same patient column. The full season's grand total, written out at last in her own small, careful hand, at the very bottom of a page that had begun back in bleak March, with a single grim entry of $42 owed and nothing whatsoever set against it, came to $106 and change in total, earned entirely from a single resource that had cost her, from the very first rod she had ever cut on that cold gray March morning, nothing whatsoever beyond her own 2 hands, 1 borrowed spade, 1 blacksmith's dime, and something very close to 640 finished baskets honest worth of steady labor across a single working season. She sat with that final number a long while before she closed the ledger, thinking not of Judd Kane, nor even of Reuben Tatum's cautious-about face, but of her own grandmother, dead 15 years, whose one surviving basket still sat on the same table, not 2 feet from where the ledger lay open, and she thought that if there was any justice at all in the arrangement of things, some small part of that old woman's own quiet, patient stubbornness had crossed a continent and outlived her after all, carried in nothing grander than a granddaughter's 2 hands and a willingness to be laughed at. She rode into Milstead on the very last morning of September, a full 2 days ahead of the note's own hard due date, and walked into Elmer Griggs's small, plain office at the grain elevator with the complete $42 counted carefully out into a small cloth bag beforehand, along with, though it was not strictly required of her by the note's own terms, one small basket of her own very best weave, set quietly on the corner of his desk, as a kind of unspoken calling card. Griggs counted the coin through twice over, the careful way men in his particular line of business always seemed to count things, entered the note as paid in full in his own neat ledger, and handed the canceled paper itself back across the desk to her with a look on his own face that Naomi would remember clearly for a long while afterward. Not quite open surprise, and not quite outright respect either, but something settling into place between the two. He turned the small basket over once in his own hands before she took her leave, asked her, almost as a passing afterthought, whether she had ever given any real thought to weaving something a good deal sturdier for his own freight trade. Proper hampers, built specifically to travel rough county roads under a fully loaded wagon without ever coming apart, and told her plainly, when she said she would give the whole idea real and serious thought, that he would be entirely glad to discuss fair terms with her whenever she felt herself ready to talk business. Judd Kane, as it happened that particular morning, was standing right there at the elevator's own loading dock settling his own grain account at that very same hour, close enough to overhear every single word of the whole exchange. And though Naomi did not once turn to look directly at him on her own way back out to the waiting wagon, she heard, behind her, no laughter at all rising from that direction. Only, after one long and telling pause, the particular quality of silence that belongs to a man quietly deciding, at long last, that he had nothing further worth saying on the subject. Naomi did not intend, once that note stood paid in full and the whole season's baskets sold, to spend another single spring depending entirely on whatever brush her neighbors happened to be burning in any given year, gathered wherever it happened to grow along the river, in whatever uneven mix of quality the flood bottom happened to offer up that particular season. She had learned a very great deal that whole summer about precisely which of her own willow stools along the flood bend had reliably thrown up the straightest, longest, most dependably pliable rods, and which had given her nothing much beyond the coarse, difficult growth she had long since learned to sort carefully out and set aside, and she had no intention whatsoever of leaving the entire future of her hard-won trade to simple chance ever again. In the last weeks of October, once the main harvest orders stood fully filled and delivered, and the county's general talk of the widow Slate had shifted from open mockery to a kind of grudging local pride, she and Eli walked the whole flood bend together one crisp afternoon, carefully marking every stool that had served her best across that first full season by the same small scraps of red yarn she had tied there back in March, and she took fresh cuttings from each one in turn, foot-long lengths of the straightest, healthiest one-year wood she could find, each one cut clean at both ends with a sharp knife, and set them, through the last mild days remaining before the ground finally turned hard for winter, into neat, even rows on a full half-acre of her own reclaimed bottomland that she and Susan Dyer had cleared and turned over together with real care that same month. Willow, she had learned from Elias Tarrant over one long, unhurried autumn evening spent together at her own kitchen table, rooted readily and reliably from a simple cutting almost more than any other plant a person could easily name. pushed firmly into good, damp ground in proper order. Some 300 of those careful cuttings would take root by the following spring, and where a wild, scattered flood bend had given her some 4,000 rods of decidedly mixed and uncertain quality across one hard season of pure scavenging, a properly planted and deliberately coppiced bed of her own, cut back hard every single winter, exactly the way the wild brush along that same river had always naturally been cut, would give her, within 2 or 3 patient years, a steady, expanding, entirely reliable crop that answered to nobody's careless burn pile, but her own considered management from that point forward. She built, that same busy autumn, a proper working shop out of the old grain end of her own barn, with a real, permanent soaking trough dug and carefully clay-lined along one whole wall, in place of the shallow, once-cracked trench she had puddled together by hand back in March. A grading frame built a good deal sturdier than her first rough scrapboard effort had ever been, and shelving enough at long last to hold a full season's worth of finished stock without ever stacking baskets 3 deep across every available surface of her own front room, the way she had been forced to manage that whole first difficult summer. Susan Dyer stayed on with her into the winter at a fair standing wage, and by the season's first hard frost, Naomi had begun, almost without ever quite planning to do so, teaching the younger girl the very same weaving her own hands had first learned that spring through 11 honestly failed bases and 1 very costly batch of publicly rejected fruit baskets. Passing along, in her own kitchen, by her own patient lamplight, the identical kind of unhurried, generous instruction Elias Tarrant had once carried a full mile down the Milstead Road to offer her, entirely unasked, standing at her own gate at dusk. Susan took to the slath and the staking up faster than Naomi ever had herself, though she struggled at first with the very same patience the border demanded, and Naomi found herself saying more than once that winter some version of the same blunt, unhurried words Tarrant had once said to her, and understanding, only as the words left her own mouth, exactly how a craft actually got itself handed on down a whole county, one patient evening at a time. Tarrant himself came by most weeks that whole autumn, leaning easily on his blackthorn stick in the doorway of her new workshop, watching Naomi and Susan work together with the particular quiet satisfaction of an old man who has finally, after 50 full years and 2 entire countries, found a genuine trade worth carefully handing on to someone else, rather than simply watching it quietly die out for good, alongside his own stiffening hands. He told her once, standing easily in the low gold light of a late October afternoon, while she packed the last of that season's willow cuttings carefully into the fresh bed, that his own father had first planted his family's osier holt back in Kent, the better part of 60 full years before Naomi Slate had even been born into this world, and that a bed planted with real care, cut back and properly managed right from the very start, would go on outliving the person who first set those original cuttings into the ground by a good deal more than 60 years besides, a thought Naomi carried with her, turning it over slowly, all the way back up to the house in the last of that day's fading golden light. The ledger sat open on Naomi's own kitchen table most evenings that whole winter, the same way it had sat open nearly every single evening since that bitter January morning she had first read Peter's note through by lamplight and understood, fully and finally, exactly what it would cost her should she ever fail to answer it in time. It looked altogether different by then, turning back through its own pages. Where the entries from March ran thin and visibly worried, a widow's careful, frightened arithmetic set down against a debt standing over almost nothing at all, the columns running steadily on from June clear through October, filled out page after page into something that finally looked a good deal less like plain fear committed to paper and a good deal more like an honest trade a person could genuinely stand upon with both feet. Stacked neatly along the new shelves of her workshop that winter sat the last of that season's unsold stock, A full dozen fine market baskets, pale and tightly woven from her very best white rods. A further half-dozen sturdier, brown-barked harvest baskets, already waiting quietly on spring orders long since promised. And, set carefully apart on a small shelf entirely of its own, the very first crooked base Eli had laughed at so freely back in May, which Naomi had, in the end, never actually burned after all, and had taken instead to keeping on open display, half as a private joke on her own earlier self, and half as a standing reminder of exactly how far 11 honest failures and one very costly public mistake could ultimately carry a person, given enough patient evenings and enough plain stubbornness to see the whole thing through. Beside the open ledger on the table itself sat a small wooden box that had once, back in the depths of that grim January, held nothing whatsoever beyond a widow's very last $3 hidden beneath a loose floorboard, and now held, at the close of that first full season, the plain, entirely unglamorous evidence of everything the Willow had actually gone on to earn her. Coin counted and quietly recounted the careful way she had always counted absolutely everything in her life, out of long habit, far more than any lingering doubt. She added one more line to that ledger before she closed it for the night. Not a figure this time, but a date. The day, the following March. She meant to make her very first cutting off the new bed rather than the old wild band. And beneath it, in the same careful hand, a second date, a full year past, that the day she judged the bed would finally carry her whole trade on its own, without one more armful ever again gathered from another man's fire. Susan Dyer kept her own tally, too, that first winter, in a small book Naomi had given her as a Christmas gift, and she showed it to Naomi one night with real pride. 11 bases woven on her own, 4 of them sound on the first try, a number Naomi had taken 13 attempts and one very bad spring to reach herself. Eli, for his part, had stopped calling the crooked base a joke by then. He called it the first one, plain and simple, the way a person names a thing that matters. Naomi let both names stand. A trade, she had come to believe, needed both kinds of memory kept close at hand, the failures honest and unburned on their own shelf, and the plain, steady count of what finally came right. What Naomi Slate had actually sold that whole remarkable year, she came to understand slowly sometime that following winter, turning the whole strange arithmetic of it over in her mind, the unhurried way she turned a single rod carefully in her own 2 hands before ever trusting it into a weave, was never truly the baskets themselves, not at the bottom of it. Reuben Tatum had not, in the final and honest accounting, paid her for mere willow and plain labor. He had paid her in the end for a basket he could load, swing, and drop hard in front of a wholesale buyer without one moment's worry crossing his mind. The very same hard-won trust that Jonas Pratt had gone on to purchase 150 times over for his own tired picking cruise. The identical trust that Garrett Loomis had bought again for his own hop yard. The same trust that had, between the whole of them together, quietly turned a crushing debt of $42, owed by a woman left with nothing in the world beyond one milk cow and a stubborn 15-year-old memory of her own grandmother's patient hands, into $106 honestly earned from a single resource that every other farmer along the entire length of the Coldbrook had spent that whole spring cheerfully setting on fire. She was not, by the season's first real snowfall that winter, a rich woman. Not by any measure the county's handful of truly prosperous families would ever have recognized as riches in their own right. She was instead a widow with a note paid fully and finally in full, a freshly planted coppice bed quietly waiting on its own first spring, a growing, well-regarded trade with her own name now firmly attached to it in a good and respected way, rather than a mocking one, a hired girl steadily learning a genuine skill of her own at Naomi's own kitchen table, and one 6-year-old boy who had watched his mother across one long and difficult year turn an entire river full of another man's trash brush into very nearly the whole of the inheritance she had left in the world to give him. It was, Elias Tarrant told her once more, quietly, before that first hard winter finally closed in around them all for good, exactly the particular kind of fortune that lasted across real time. Not the sudden, once-won kind of fortune that a person wins outright in a single stroke and spends carelessly back down to nothing, but the slow, patient, deliberately coppiced kind instead, cut back hard every single season without fail and always, reliably, dependably, growing back stronger than it had ever stood the year before. If this is the sort of story that makes the long stretch of your own evening feel genuinely worth staying through to the end for, I would be glad indeed to have you back again for the next one. Tap like on your way back out. Subscribe if you would care for more true-to-craft frontier stories built exactly like this one, and tell me down in the comments which of Barrow County's own neighbors you would have laughed at the hardest back in that cold March. Judd Kane, who lived to eat every single word of it before the year was through, or the widow herself, who never once looked up from her own steady work long enough to even notice the laughing at all.